Senator Scullion.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The Wild Rivers debate has been going on for some time now. I have already informed Senators Xenophon, Senators Fielding and those opposite about our intentions in regard to the legislation today. The fundamentals, I think we'll just leave with the fundamentals of this legislation, is to provide some equity and some consistency in the approach of the Queensland Government in regard to the provision of conservation, particularly on Aboriginal land of all types. Probably some of the most celebrated outcomes in North Queensland have been the allocation of quite large national parks under Premier Bligh, and I can remember the national parks that were actually related to some particularly fantastic biodiversity, and the process to be able to get those parks, of course, was the thing that would be celebrated. Aboriginal people sat down for a very long time and discussed how they would have a joint management of the park, very similar to the place I come from, the Northern Territory, to Kakadu National Park. And there was an agreement that there would be a joint approach, joint arrangements of the park. The landowners, the Aboriginal people, would sit down as a board and have a joint management of the park where Aboriginal people would be able to advise the park managers, who at that stage knew lots about conservation, little about cultural heritage, little about the way that Aboriginal people interacted with their land. And then at a later stage there was a movement that the Aboriginal people in the area slowly grew in stature in terms of their capacity to act as the bureaucracy and as the board process to ensure that they were able to take over those roles in time. And I think that Kakadu Park is in fact emblematic of how it should be done. So those two of the examples in North Queensland, particularly in the area around Cowan, they're celebrated because we now have excellent conservation, and the particular element to be excited about is not so much that it represents some of the greatest biodiversity in the world. It is in fact the fact that Aboriginal people provided their consent. Because if you're making a national park in Queensland and you're changing fundamentally all of the ways that we do business, then you need to understand that consent is an absolute fundamental in that process. And sadly, the Wild Rivers process was an alternative process to the Queensland Government, and in the region of Cowan, after going through a very long process that took a couple of years, but ended up with a celebrated process that protected biodiversity, that ensured that all of those people involved had complete ownership of it, and it was a deal. Joint management. This is how many rangers are going to be involved. This is how the management process will work. This is how access will happen. This is how Aboriginal people will continue to conduct cultural activities. This is how Aboriginal people will interact with tourism. This is how you will grow in stature in terms of being able to manage the park. All of those issues were really setting the groundwork for the future. Now, this is, of course, in stark contrast to the Wild Rivers process. Now, the Wild Rivers, as a particular piece of legislation, is not particularly different from any other conservation legislation, but the principles still apply. We believe it's a particular area of unique biodiversity, and so we are going to apply some particular protections that specifically protect that biodiversity. And in terms of a river, that's what Wild Rivers do. It talks specifically about the sort of issues that they need to protect the river from. They need to specifically discuss or protect those areas of biodiversity that have been identified. And it's just like a national park. Most of the areas the Wild Rivers Act in Queensland I'd have to commend. I think it's a good act, and I think some of the outcomes in it will be excellent. But the reason for the Wild Rivers Environmental Management Bill of 2011, my private member's bill, has been brought forward, is that there is one stark difference. And that stark difference between a national park in Queensland, which provides good conservation outcomes, and a Wild Rivers Declaration in Queensland, which also provides good environmental outcomes, is that one is provided with the consent and ownership of the owners of the land, the Aboriginal people of the land, and one is not. That's the only difference. And I think, whilst it seems like a small difference, it is obviously a very, very important difference, particularly to the people of Cape York. And one of the reasons it's of particular interest to the people of Cape York, because they are in fact the holders of what is, without argument, some of the most wonderful and complex biodiversity in the world. And that's why it remains not only, in a sense, a tourist attraction, but in so many ways the world's eyes are on places like Cape York because it is emblematic of the remnant, perfect biodiversity. And the reason for that, of course, is that it has been maintained in that state by the Aboriginal owners, who are principally the nature of title there is native title. And the reason that it is in that state is because they have had connection with that country for so long. They have had connection with those areas for so long. So they are the reason why the biodiversity is so excellent. They are the reasons why this country has been looked after so well. And that's why a joint management agreement is an agreement in a sense that says this is something that we can gather, and this is something that we can ensure will be an essence or a fundamental building block about how we continue to look after the biodiversity. Why would you possibly ignore the single group of people who have protected this iconic biodiversity since time immemorial? In the national parks we don't. The national parks in Queensland we actually have a system that completely protects the essence of the Aboriginal people who built those levels of protection. Sadly, in the Wild Rivers declarations there is no such attachment or association, so it's no wonder, it should be of no surprise and no wonder to anyone why, apart from a very small handful, I haven't actually met more than I can count on one hand, that the entire Aboriginal people of the Cape find that the element of the Wild Rivers Bill of Queensland odious, and that is that they're not required to have their consent. So this isn't conservation by consent, as it is with those very successful and celebrated national parks. This is conservation by dictate. This is something you will have. And I don't think anyone in Australia is in any doubt that, given those circumstances, that we should in fact be supporting a change to the Wild Rivers legislation in Queensland that puts into effect the very same mechanisms that they have, for example, national parks. And I think that it should be said that I have approached the Queensland Government, as have many, because it is not the normal way to do business for the Commonwealth to intervene in a state. And I can tell you, coming from the Territory, I find it particularly odious that we should do so. But this is a circumstance and a case that is just so very important that we've made all of those calls. So I've asked myself, well, where's the mischief? Premier Bligh a fine woman, and I'm sure she means well. But I'm sure she means well, because I've read her media reports about the celebrated deals that were done with the national park. And isn't this fantastic that we've got Aboriginal people on their land working for conservation outcomes side by side? Side by side. So I know she celebrates that. And she hasn't been able to, and nor have anyone in Queensland been able to say to me, well, why is it that we would have this inconsistency? Why is it that in the Wild Rivers legislation, which we just simply make a declaration over that land, there's no consent required? Why is the difference? And there's silence. There's silence. And of course, some as cynical than me and more cynical than me would say, well, after all, the Premier is a politician, and you know, we have heard about the green deals. Green preferences are important.
It was in a West End coffee shop before the last Queensland election.
And it's been alleged to have coffee involved. But the Premier clearly, those of us who are a little cynical, have accepted that there is special arrangements with the Wild Rivers legislation. Well, why would you have special arrangements? We've got arrangements in place that work. Empowerment. Working next to Aboriginal people who know how to look after the land because they looked after the land well before white people stood on this earth. And so the only reason I think could be that they have simply done a deal. And we know that the Wilderness Society and those associated, and they have some, very good outcomes. They're trying to protect the environment. And I just think we've lost touch with the balance. Because the balance for Premier Bligh was, if I accept from you your preferences from the Greens, well, I need them. What would you like in exchange? And clearly the exchange was, well, we'll go and have Wild Rivers. Well, what's Wild Rivers going to do? Oh, it takes a little time to deliver national park-like mechanisms because we have to have the consent of people. We have to have people agree. No, we can't have that in it. So the legislation was passed with a lot of opposition, but not sufficient opposition, obviously, without the notion of consent. Now, this is people's land they haven't received. It's young land. They haven't had it very long. They haven't had the land very long. And now, suddenly, this particularly difficult, different piece of legislation, because of some grubby Greens preference, that's the only reason, is substantially different about how we go about a partnership approach for conservation. And it's still not too late, Premier Bligh. It's still up to you. You can change your own legislation to make it consistent with your approach in national parks. You can still do this. And all of the people I speak to across the Cape, of course, wish to embrace the opportunities for conservation. They want to do that. We've got examples all over the place for doing that. But that simple respect of saying that we will require the consent of Aboriginal people. We'll require their consent. And that's exactly what the Wild Rivers Environmental Management Bill of 2001 would have done. It is simply to ensure that Aboriginal people are fully involved and we can get the full benefits of the wisdom of Aboriginal people, the consent, which is just about respect. And we stand up in this place today, and for those in the gallery and for those in the room, we can recall the President this morning rising and saying that we'd like to also acknowledge the Ngunnawal and Gunberry people of the Canberra area. And that is all about respecting the ownership of land. And sadly, in my view, the Queensland Government, or elements of the Queensland Government, have, perhaps not through mischief, but they have certainly been disrespectful of the way that they are treating Aboriginal people who are the traditional owners of land and are owners of land in Queensland in this matter. So that's the motive behind this bill. It's a very simple motive, and clearly, as I've indicated, I don't have the support today because there are still some concerns with the bill, and we'll be speaking to a number of people to try to ensure that we have those amendments correctly, because this is such an important area of consideration. I would commend those people on the other side who, and I understand Senator Furner, you've had a great interest in this, mate. And look into your heart. If you think there are other amendments, or if you think you can ring the Premier yourself, and if you want to do some real good for the people of Cape York, and I know you do, mate, is that you need to reach into your heart and that you need to do the business of ensuring that the Queensland Government and make sure that they can do the right thing.